Anthony Whitehead had never been one to follow a predetermined path. Raised in the shadow of his father's success, he rejected expectations, carving out a life on his own terms. Hard work had been his answer to privilege, discipline his shield against entitlement. His hands had known both the weight of labor and the sting of a fight, lessons learned in places far removed from boardrooms and wealth. The factory was a far cry from the home he had grown up in, yet it suited him. The clamor of machinery, the hum of industry, these were the sounds of something built through effort, not inheritance. As the year wound down and the plant prepared to close for the holiday, Anthony moved through the floor with practiced ease, already thinking ahead to what came next. The last night of the year was crisp and cloudless, but the weak winter sun offered no relief from the biting cold. Inside the factory, metal walls lined with spray foam did little to keep the chill from creeping up through the bare concrete floor. The air was thick with the clatter of machinery, making it difficult to think. Anthony Whitehead, director of operations, moved briskly across the floor, his sharp eyes locking onto shop supervisor Brent Collier. Anthony had the strong, lean build of a man accustomed to physical labor. Though his father could have paid for his education, he had chosen to make his own way, cutting ties with the man completely. He stayed in shape by training at Arthur Porter's gym, the same place where Garland Louvier, a rising Cajun boxing star, once prepared for his fights. Garland had stepped into the ring overconfident against veteran heavyweight Xavier Smith. He never walked out, carried away on a stretcher beneath a white sheet. Porter trained every fighter like they might be the next fallen champion. The factory would shut down early for the holiday, with workers sent home but paid through the end of their shifts. Anthony made sure timesheets would be left at his door. Brent, always with a smirk that hinted at his true nature, acknowledged the instructions. That morning, Anthony was jolted awake by a call from his mother. Hungover, he shoved aside a few empty beer cans before answering. His father was dead. It wasn't shocking. After a bitter divorce, his father had married a much younger woman, only to suffer a debilitating stroke 2 years later. He clung to life for another 3 years before finally letting go. His wife, Cheyenne, barely reacted to the news, more annoyed by the disruption to her sleep than the loss of a man she barely acknowledged. Annoyed, Anthony dragged himself downstairs, flipping on the kitchen light. Cockroaches scattered. A foul odor clung to the air, its source unclear. He started cleaning, tossing out bags of takeout containers from the fridge and wiping down counters. Cheyenne, watching with amusement, poured herself a glass of wine, her chosen cure for a hangover, despite it being barely morning. By the time he brewed coffee, the kitchen trash was overflowing, and he had to haul a large garbage bag to the curb. The house, in the daylight, revealed the extent of its neglect. Rings from beer cans scarred the mahogany furniture, dust coated every surface, and the stairs were long overdue for sweeping. Cheyenne offered to order lunch, but had no intention of driving to pick it up. After eating, she drank more, switching from wine to vodka, lounging as Anthony tried and failed to scrub away the damage on the coffee table. Frustration mounted. He abandoned the mess and headed upstairs, noticing the grime clinging to each step. The bathroom light flickered before flooding the room in harsh brightness. Of the 3 bulbs over the mirror, only one still had its frosted cover, softening the glare. The others were bare, their sharp light stabbing into his exhausted eyes. Anthony's face was bloated, dark circles under his eyes. His unshaven jaw was covered in rough, light brown stubble, and his disheveled blonde hair added to his worn-out appearance. Cheyenne found his reflection amusing, tossing a sarcastic remark his way. Anthony barely reacted. He knew exactly why he had married her, loud, brash, and impossible to ignore. Her curves, her bleached hair, even the dark roots peeking through. He had liked all of it. But most of all, she infuriated his father. Marcus Whitehead had despised her, once raging so hard at the thought of her getting pregnant that he'd threatened to liquidate her. That alone had been reason enough for Anthony to put a ring on her finger. Now, 14 years later, he stared at himself in the grimy bathroom mirror, wondering what had possessed him to buy this crumbling house, to let himself become this swollen, unkempt version of the man he once was. The only thing that still worked properly was the water heater. He grabbed a damp cloth, softening his overgrown stubble before shaving. Cheyenne lost interest and wandered off in search of more alcohol. His headache throbbed the entire time. After his shower, he grabbed a dress shirt only to find it barely buttoned over his stomach. The same went for his best suit. At some point, he had stopped paying attention and let himself go. As he walked downstairs, Cheyenne, now more focused on their dwindling beer supply, offhandedly mentioned that her mother had expressed condolences about his father's death. Anthony gave a dry response, glancing around the house. It had once been worth $200,000, but in its current state, they'd be lucky to get half that. He recalled weighing 171 pounds on their wedding day and was now too afraid to step on a scale. Cheyenne smugly claimed she still weighed the same, though Anthony wasn't convinced. Frustration boiled over. He was done with the drinking, the mess, all of it, but Cheyenne refused to believe any of this had anything to do with her. Anthony left, heading to his mother's house, where his siblings, Jimmy and Lisa, were already gathered. Susan, their mother, sat between them at the breakfast table, sipping coffee. After exchanging brief hugs and greetings, conversation quickly shifted to the funeral. His sisters had refused to attend, leaving Anthony to convince them otherwise. Then came another request. He was expected to give the obituary. He scoffed at the idea, struggling to find anything positive to say about his father. The man had been stubborn, selfish, and only acted when it served him. Still, in the end, he agreed. Before leaving, he congratulated Jimmy on his anniversary and checked in on Lisa's daughter, Gracie. Lisa proudly reported her grades were holding steady. Back home, Cheyenne was already plotting their next binge, mentioning that Lionel would be stopping by with more alcohol. Anthony shut it down immediately. He refused to fund it anymore. If she wanted it, she could figure it out herself. By the time Lionel arrived, she had miraculously scraped together the money. Anthony nearly poured himself a glass, but resisted, redirecting his focus toward writing the obituary. Late that night, while Cheyenne slept, he emptied her wallet, every credit and debit card, locked away in their office safe. He did the same with his own, keeping just one for necessities. The next morning, he left before she woke, heading to a diner for breakfast. His head pounded, his hands shook as he gripped his coffee. Then came the inevitable call, Cheyenne's voice shrieking through the phone, demanding to know where her cards had gone. Anthony, still exhausted, barely flinched. He simply told her the truth. She didn't have any cards anymore. And when she kept yelling, he cut her off. His headache was bad enough without her making it worse. Anthony ended the call just as Cheyenne's shouting escalated. He ignored the next incoming call, letting it go to voicemail. As her furious message began playing, he briefly wondered where she found the energy to scream like that. His head pounded too much for him to care. Shortly after, Mitch Doofer from First Union Bank called. Cheyenne had tried to get a new debit card linked to Anthony's account. Calmly but firmly, Anthony made it clear. She had access only to accounts in her own name. If a single dime of his money ended up in her hands, he'd take his business elsewhere. Mitch got the message. Another voicemail followed, 1 minute and 48 seconds of pure rage. As he listened, Anthony realized he was passing Whitehead Generators, the massive steel building that bore his father's name, his own name. Cheyenne's threats of divorce blasted through the speaker, and for the first time in a while, Anthony felt relief. It was the first reasonable thing she'd said in years. His lawyer, Nick Fowler, was dead, something Anthony vaguely recalled from a letter he had received months ago. The law firm handling his case had changed, but he couldn't remember the new attorney's name. Instead of wasting time navigating an automated phone system, he decided to head home and find the letter. That turned out to be a mistake. Cheyenne was deep in a drunken haze, and she wasn't alone. Her mother and her latest boyfriend, Uncle Bootsy, were there too. For some reason, Bootsy felt the need to lecture Anthony about Cheyenne's financial rights. Anthony, sensing trouble, started recording the confrontation on his phone. When Bootsy jabbed a bony finger into his chest, Anthony warned him to back off. The old man ignored him and did it again. Anthony reacted instinctively, striking fast. Bootsy, once boasting about his army days, wasn't quick enough to dodge a well-placed knee to the groin and a follow-up to the nose. Bootsy collapsed, while Cheyenne and her mother fell silent. Anthony, unmoved, ordered them all out. Locking himself in his office, he searched for the letter from the law firm. It didn't take long to notice that his desk had been tampered with and the safe had been moved. Without the key, though, Cheyenne had no way of opening it. Finally, he found what he was looking for. Carter Fullalove was now handling his case. Before he could send an email, Cheyenne banged on the door. The police had arrived. Anthony sighed. That was fast. No sirens, though. Bootsy, still bleeding, tried playing the victim. Anthony didn't hesitate. He struck him again, dropping him to the stained carpet. Cheyenne shrieked. Her mother panicked, but Anthony remained unfazed. Sirens finally blared outside. As the police arrived, Cheyenne scrambled to hide any trace of pills or illegal substances from the living room, stuffing things into the kitchen instead. Anthony met the officers calmly, directing them toward the mess. As Cheyenne lunged at him in fury, he allowed himself to be cuffed without resistance. The officer apologized, But since the emergency call claimed Anthony was the aggressor, procedure required them to take him in. Cheyenne, on the other hand, fought the arrest tooth and nail. Meanwhile, the ambulance carted Bootsy off, with Cheyenne's mother trailing behind. Before being escorted to the squad car, Anthony received his house keys back and was told how to activate the alarm. He nodded in thanks. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered across the street watching the scene unfold. Anthony surveyed them, realizing that despite living here for years, he couldn't name a single one. As Cheyenne continued struggling against the officers, Anthony turned to one of them with a smirk. "Do me a favor," he said. "Yeah? Make sure we don't end up in the same cell." The officers chuckled. "We'll see what we can do." "Promise we won't," one added. As the police car pulled away, Anthony dialed the law firm. It was time to set things in motion. Anthony dialed the extension for Carter Fullalove and left a message. Before he could think further, a policewoman interrupted, asking if he knew who Cheyenne's lawyer was. He had no idea. He didn't even know she had one. At the courthouse, Cheyenne's shrieking echoed as she fought the bailiffs. Carter, an unreadable but sharp attorney, listened as Anthony filled him in. He agreed to handle the divorce, but insisted they focus on the hearing first. Assistant District Attorney David Hightower reviewed Anthony's case, noting his steady employment with St. Anne Parish. That alone kept him from being considered a flight risk. With no request for bail, Judge Linda Newberg dismissed the case, though Cheyenne continued her public meltdown as she was escorted out. Anthony wasted no time. After a shower, a shave, and a change of clothes, he called Carter to move forward. His father had died 2 days prior, and while their relationship had been far from warm, Anthony needed to ensure Cheyenne wouldn't touch a cent of any inheritance. Filing for divorce before the will reading was the best move. Thanks to her courtroom behavior, serving her would be easy. At Marcus Whitehead's visitation, Anthony barely squeezed into his old suit and had to buy a new one. His sisters, Cindy and Barbara, attended only to support their mother. His eulogy highlighted his father's business empire and ended with a wry anecdote about how difficult it was to love a troublesome son. Lisa teased him for making it sound heartfelt, and he laughed, embracing her. Meanwhile, Cheyenne managed to turn her jail stint into a court-approved rehab stay, covered by Anthony's insurance. Since it was a civil matter, Carter couldn't force information out of the facility, though they both knew exactly how she got there. "She's either smart or lucky," Carter mused. Anthony knew better. She was just manipulative. The next day, the will reading took the family by surprise. Despite abandoning them for his second wife, Marcus had not forgotten his first family financially. In the lawyer's conference room, Susan Whitehead wasted no time, calling for an immediate board meeting for Whitehead Generators. She was swiftly appointed CEO. Anthony, however, voted against his own appointment as COO, reminding them that he was already employed. His siblings didn't let up. Jimmy pointed out the salary difference, and Lisa pressed him on the importance of protecting the family's wealth, including his niece Gracie's future. Begrudgingly, Anthony relented. He would resign from his job on Monday. "That's blackmail," he muttered, "using Gracie against me." Monday morning started with a call from Anthony's insurance company, informing him that Cheyenne had checked herself out of treatment without permission. He immediately called Carter, who contacted Cass Jackson to serve her divorce papers. Cass wasted no time. Within minutes, he was at Donna Frick's trailer, catching Cheyenne off guard. She handed him cash, thinking he was there for something else, but Cass simply smiled, handed her the summons, and left. Anthony didn't need confirmation that she'd been served. Her angry calls and text messages came in rapid succession. When she called his work phone, screaming, he kept his voice steady, reminding her that he was busy. In truth, confrontation drained him. Later, at lunch with his colleague Anne, he listened as she spoke about the struggles of single motherhood, balancing 3 kids in a cramped apartment, making hard choices between necessities. She joked about putting pins in a voodoo doll of her ex. Anthony admitted he had wanted children, but with Cheyenne, a child would have always had to compete for attention. Over the next week, Cheyenne alternated between begging Anthony to come home and demanding money to pay off a debt. He offered to settle it if she agreed to the divorce terms. She refused. "Do you know why divorce is so expensive?" Anthony muttered to Anne after another tense call. "Why?" "Because it's worth it." As his last day at work approached, co-workers stopped by to say goodbye, some jokingly measuring his office like they were ready to move in. Before leaving, he handed Anne an envelope, 4 tickets to a ranch retreat in Oakleaf, Texas for her and her kids. She was speechless. At Whitehead Generators, his first day as COO was a blur of introductions and observations. His head pounded, and his ears rang from the factory noise. On the way home, he passed a low cinder-block building, Arthur Porter's gym. The sign announced it was now open. Arthur, nearly deaf and perpetually yelling, took one look at Anthony and signed him up for a year-long membership. No discussion. Meanwhile, Carter called with another update. Cheyenne was requesting marriage counseling. Anthony laughed but agreed. On one condition, she had to pay for it. When she called, furious, Anthony cut her off. "If you want it, you pay for it." "You don't want to work on our marriage?" she asked, suddenly soft. "Honestly? No." Somehow, she managed to pay for her first session with Dr. Sylvia Hooperstein. In the waiting room, Anthony quietly filled out his paperwork. Under employer, he wrote none. Under insurance, he also wrote none. In the additional source of income field, he simply put obscenity. The receptionist, Marnie Vogel, smirked when she read it. When Cheyenne handed in her own form, Marnie's expression darkened. "Dr. Hooperstein will see you now," she said, gesturing toward the door. Anthony gestured for Cheyenne to go first. "Ladies first." It was the first thing he'd said to her since they walked in. Within 10 minutes of their first counseling session, Anthony knew it was pointless. Dr. Sylvia Hooperstein's advice felt generic, and Cheyenne monopolized the session, talking non-stop for 35 minutes. When Anthony was finally asked how he felt about her words, he simply said it was nice, because, for once, she wasn't screaming. By the third session, Sylvia suggested individual counseling in addition to couples therapy. Anthony refused. Sylvia, in turn, accused him of having anger toward women. He calmly listed his mother, sister, and niece, 3 women he deeply respected and loved. Cheyenne mocked each one. Anthony stood up and walked out. If Cheyenne wanted these sessions, she could pay for them. Carter found the whole thing amusing. "Did I hear you call Dr. Hooperstein a charlatan?" He laughed over the phone. Anthony smirked. So much for medical confidentiality. Somehow Cheyenne's lawyer managed to drag Anthony back into court, demanding he continue therapy and pay for it. Judge Theriol agreed to 8 more sessions, but with a different therapist, Dr. Jackie Trahan. Dr. Trahan was sharp, fair, and wasted no time. She gave each of them equal time to speak and even reprimanded Cheyenne for interrupting. When asked what she wanted from therapy, Cheyenne bluntly declared, "I want my marriage back." Behind her, Anthony silently shook his head. As they left, he admitted he liked Dr. Trahan's approach. Cheyenne, however, accused her of seducing him during the session. "Well, next time I'll pay attention," Anthony joked. There was no next time. A court official's surprise visit to Cheyenne's home uncovered pills in plain sight. Meanwhile, her former lover, John Bootsy Bordelin, made things worse for himself. After threatening Anthony in front of a judge and prosecutor, what could have been probation turned into a 40-month prison sentence. He never made it there. Bootsy died of a massive heart attack 2 days later. At Whitehead Generators, Anthony faced a different battle. Employees resented his sudden leadership, believing he hadn't earned his place. Production had slowed to a crawl. Meetings with department heads led nowhere. They, too, thought he should have started at the bottom like they had. After an overseas client's angry call, Anthony made a decision. His mother and sister supported whatever he had planned. The next morning, the factory break room overflowed with tornado donuts, hot coffee, and gallons of milk. Employees laughed, ate, and enjoyed the unexpected treat. Then, Anthony stood, drawing their attention to a massive bar graph. He pointed to the red line, last year's production numbers. "Good, right?" Murmurs of agreement followed. "Those numbers meant bonuses in your Christmas stockings," he continued. Someone started to object, but Anthony cut him off. "They were issued 2 days before Christmas. That makes them Christmas bonuses. If anyone disagrees, you can return them." Silence. "Didn't think so," he smirked. Then he pointed to the blue line. This year's numbers dramatically lower. "What changed? Demand? No. Supply? No. Shipping delays? No. So what's different?" More silence. Some employees glanced at the floor. "The only thing that changed was my father's death. And last I checked, he wasn't down here unloading trucks, assembling parts, or managing production. He sat in an office, making sure bills were paid and you got your paychecks. That hasn't changed." No one spoke. Anthony let the weight of his words settle, then casually removed the graph, folded it, and tossed it in the trash. Anthony set a strict deadline: 6 weeks to restore production levels, or every single worker would lose their job. There were no exceptions. Without another word, he turned and walked up the metal stairs to his office. Less than a month later, Lisa reported that not only had production rebounded, but output was on track to surpass the previous year's numbers. Jimmy suggested rewarding the employees with a bonus, but Anthony dismissed the idea. He saw no reason to reward people for merely doing the jobs they were hired for, especially since it had taken the threat of layoffs to motivate them. Lisa was taken aback by his bluntness, but Susan overruled him, insisting that Christmas bonuses would be issued regardless. She made it clear that if necessary, she would cover the cost herself. Despite moving forward with his life, Anthony continued paying for utilities and home insurance at the house he once shared with Cheyenne. Initially, he considered relocating closer to the plant, but the surrounding neighborhoods were unappealing. Many homes were decades old and showed signs of neglect. His mother's gated community near Hardington Acres Golf Club was an option, but it didn't feel right. More importantly, Cheyenne, though still incarcerated, wouldn't be behind bars forever. He needed a clean break. His search for a new home led him to Carmen Davis, a skilled and personable realtor who stood out from the previous agents he had dealt with. She quickly found a rare listing in Hardington, where houses rarely became available unless someone passed away. The moment Anthony saw the property, he knew it was the one. The 3-story house had a deep brown brick exterior with warm wood accents. A separate 3-car garage built to match the house included a guest apartment above it. Inside, the home was just as impressive. The first floor featured a grand hall, a library lined with built-in bookshelves, and a spacious kitchen. The second floor housed 4 large bedrooms, each with ample space. The third floor, however, held 2 private suites, each designed like a personal retreat, complete with a fireplace, a jacuzzi, and a massive walk-in closet. Standing in one of the closets, Anthony joked that it was bigger than his first apartment. Carmen, amused, mentioned her granddaughter's growing fashion sense, predicting she would need a closet just as large one day. Without hesitation, Anthony made an offer above the asking price. Hours later, while eating barbecue at Cowboy's BBQ, he received a message from Carmen confirming that his offer had been accepted. He responded immediately, instructing her to close the deal as soon as possible. Meanwhile, legal proceedings continued. Carter successfully argued that Anthony should be released from the mandatory counseling order since Cheyenne was unable to attend. The judge agreed, voiding the requirement. With that issue settled, Carter turned the discussion to the divorce petition. However, Cheyenne's attorney immediately objected, stating that his client did not consent to the divorce. Judge Theriot contacted the St. Anne Parish Clerk of Court and confirmed that Cheyenne's trial was scheduled in 4 months. With that information, the judge refused to proceed with the divorce petition, leaving Anthony to deal with yet another delay. Carter seemed ready to argue, but Anthony waved it off. The only real reason for a divorce, he mused, was to get married again, and he had no plans to make that mistake anytime soon. Carter, amused, shared a personal anecdote. He too had been convinced he would never remarry until an unexpected encounter changed everything. He now coached his stepdaughter's soccer team. Anthony joked about soccer being a lesser sport, and Carter challenged him to keep up with a group of 7-year-olds who thought they were the next David Beckham. Cheyenne's trial concluded with a hefty fine and 3 years of probation. She was warned that any violation would send her straight to prison. With no access to Anthony's number, she resorted to calling Whitehead generators. Courtney Louvier, his father's former assistant, relayed the message that Cheyenne was on line 3. When Anthony answered, Cheyenne wasted no time launching into complaints. She had first tried calling his old office, where Anne DeFranco had bluntly informed her that Anthony no longer worked there. Now, she demanded to know why their divorce hadn't progressed. Anthony reminded her that he had taken over his father's business before her latest arrest, and that counseling had been canceled due to her absence. Since she was free now, he suggested they move forward with the divorce. Cheyenne's tone shifted. Her voice trembled as she asked why. When he remained silent, she broke down, insisting that she still loved him. Anthony listened, knowing this time her tears were real, not manipulation, just raw emotion. But it didn't change the truth. He gently pointed out that while she might be capable of love, she had never truly loved him. Their marriage had been built on complaints, fights, and constant struggles. He urged her to sign the papers. Desperation crept into her voice as she pleaded for another chance, but Anthony stood firm. He admitted that for months he had finally been able to breathe without the weight of their relationship suffocating him. He had no desire to go back. Fury replaced sorrow as Cheyenne vowed to fight the divorce for as long as it took. Carter, unfazed, informed Cheyenne's lawyer that any additional legal expenses would be her responsibility. The message must have sunk in quickly because soon after, Cheyenne called Anthony, seething with resentment. She accused him of using his father's money against her, demanding to know if she was expected to obey him just because he had financial leverage now. Anthony simply replied, "Yes." Cheyenne spat insults into the phone, wishing him the worst. He calmly responded that he had already been through hell and was finally on his way out. Without another word, he ended the call. When the final divorce decree arrived, Anthony didn't need to check his voicemail to know Cheyenne had received hers. Courtney informed him she had already called, sobbing on the line. That evening, after a long day at work, Anthony returned home to find a thick envelope from St. Anne County Court sitting on his kitchen table. He stared at it for a while before finally opening it. The words were cold and impersonal, yet final. His 14-year marriage was over. There were no celebrations, no relief, just silence and a faint rustling of papers in his hands. A single tear slipped down his face. Lisa, his sister, offered quiet sympathy, while Gracie, his niece, assured him he would find someone better. Their mother, Susan, kept her thoughts to herself, but subtly expressed that this was for the best. The rest of his siblings barely reacted, assuming the divorce had been finalized years ago. At first, Cheyenne called Anthony almost daily, refusing to accept that it was truly over. Gradually, the calls became less frequent, every other day, then weekly, then monthly. Eventually, they stopped altogether. Until Christmas Eve. Cheyenne called again, her voice laced with something between smugness and desperation. She announced that she had found someone new, someone better than Anthony had ever been. Anthony barely reacted, already recognizing her attempt to provoke jealousy, but there was nothing left to feel. Cheerfully, he wished her and her mystery man a Merry Christmas and hung up. Anthony opened the bright red envelope and whistled at the number on the check, $250,000. He smiled, nodding to himself, before noticing another envelope underneath. It was a postcard from Anne DeFranco, his former colleague. Nearly 2 years had passed, but she still made a point to send him a holiday card. The front featured a photo of Anne and her 3 children on horseback, their happiness radiating from the image. Inside, she had written a short message, sharing how much they had loved their trip to Oakleaf Ranch and how they had saved up to go again this year. Her children had each scribbled their own cheerful notes. Without hesitation, Anthony booked another 2-week cattle camp for Anne and her kids, covering all expenses. He also booked the same trip for Cheyenne and a guest, knowing full well she wouldn't go. If she did, she'd likely take her mother, not whatever new man she claimed to be with. Courtney Louvier, his father's former assistant, looked concerned when she asked about his Christmas bonus. She insisted it was too much, pointing out that she hadn't done anything all day. Anthony brushed off her worries, offering a simple holiday greeting before leaving the office. As he walked across the quiet factory floor, his footsteps echoed on the concrete. In the corner, a decorated Christmas tree stood with 3 gifts beneath it. 2 had clearly been handled often, slightly dented. The third, pristine and untouched, bore his name. He refused to pick it up. The day after Christmas, Anthony indulged in a long-overdue luxury, a new Bentley. The sleek white car felt as smooth as his Ferrari, but far more refined. Even the speed bumps in the Whitehead Generator's parking lot barely registered. New Year's Eve was spent at the Hardington Acres Club, surrounded by family and acquaintances. The orchestra was exceptional, and he even danced a few times, with his niece Gracie, his sisters Lisa, Cindy, and Barbara, and Cindy's daughters, Penny and Stacy. The latter two, entitled and self-absorbed, were best avoided, but there was no easy escape from family obligations. At midnight, Anthony joined the countdown, celebrating with everyone as the new year arrived. But as the party continued, he noticed Gracie was missing. Finding her on the back porch, he saw her watching the fireworks, her nose pressed against the cold glass. She smiled when she spotted him, stepping forward to hug him and give him a quick kiss on the cheek. Her quiet whisper carried more hope than certainty. This year would be better. Now, nearly a full year later, Anthony barely thought about those words. Fatigue weighed on him instead. He realized he needed a break. He approved vacations for everyone else. Why not take one himself? Yet, as he sat at his desk, nothing appealed to him. The ranch wasn't an option. He disliked horses. Fishing in a mountain stream made him think of mosquitoes and freezing water. Skiing meant snow, and snow meant cold. The French Quarter brought images of overcrowded streets and sweaty strangers pressing against him. Cruises didn't interest him either, though his mother swore by them, mostly for the endless buffets and the weight she always claimed to gain. Amusement parks were hot, sticky, and filled with screaming children. His last experience at one had been a disaster. 6 miserable days at Disneyland, trying to console a grieving, nearly catatonic Gracie while Lisa sobbed through every ride. But even then, at the end of it all, Gracie had hugged him and whispered a quiet thank you. That single moment had made the entire ordeal worth it. Sitting in his quiet office, Anthony privately thanked his father. The man had left him with more than just a business. He had given him the strength to get through everything. At 3:46, Brent knocked, letting him know the last time sheets were ready. Anthony went through each one, adjusting hours to ensure full pay, then signed them all before shutting down for the day. Walking through the dimly lit workshop, he glanced once more at the Christmas tree. The gifts beneath it had dwindled to 2, one for an employee on vacation and the other still addressed to him. He ignored it, again refusing to pick up the neatly wrapped package. After setting the alarm, he stepped out into the cold December wind. At Arthur Porter's gym, his routine remained the same, pounding the heavy bag, then working on the speed bag. Jake Porter, Arthur's son, made a passing remark about picking up the pace. Anthony ignored him, steadily increasing his rhythm. He would never match the quick, sharp sound of a professional, but he found his own pace, steady and strong. Later that night, as he pulled into the club's parking lot for the New Year's celebration, he smiled as Gracie's green Mustang parked right behind him. They had arrived at the same time, moving in sync without planning. Bracing himself for the cold, Anthony stepped out, greeting the cheerful parking attendant who handed him his receipt. Another year was ending. Whatever came next, he was ready. Anthony stepped out of his car just as his niece, Gracie, exited the passenger side of the vehicle parked behind him. He smiled warmly, but his brow lifted slightly when an unfamiliar brunette emerged from the driver's seat. Introduced as Nancy Haybert, Gracie's friend, Anthony instinctively asked what she meant by girlfriend. Without hesitation, Nancy clarified. They were together. Inside the club, Anthony watched as Nancy instinctively cared for Gracie, unbuttoning her coat, stowing their belongings, and taking her hand. A quiet sense of relief settled over him. Gracie had someone looking out for her. A young woman at the coat check greeted Anthony with a bright smile, her big brown eyes gleaming despite one slightly crooked tooth. She wished him a happy new year, and he returned the sentiment before stepping into the ballroom. Spotting his mother deep in conversation with Joanna and Barney Siegel, he joined them, relieved that their daughter Barbara was nowhere in sight. That relief was short-lived. Barbara arrived almost immediately, as if summoned by his presence. Susan, however, had more pressing concerns. She discreetly warned him that Cheyenne was approaching, adding that she had never understood what Anthony had seen in the woman. Anthony merely joked that he had recognized too much of himself in her, to which his mother sighed and walked away. Cheyenne, clearly drunk, greeted him with a familiar grin, making sure to lean forward enough that her cleavage and signature rose tattoo were impossible to miss. She slurred a question about his supposed new partner, fumbling over the name before landing on Roland. Her balance wavered in her impossibly high heels, and despite her boasts of happiness with a younger boyfriend, Anthony could feel the misery radiating from her. He felt no jealousy, just pity. Roland Verdot arrived moments later, looking just as unsteady as Cheyenne. When Anthony extended a handshake and mentioned how happy Cheyenne had said they were, Roland clumsily pulled her close, nearly toppling them both. Anthony steadied the younger man, preventing a scene. Cheyenne, ever the provocateur, slurred out an insult about how Roland was supposedly twice the man Anthony had ever been. Amused rather than offended, Anthony agreed. If Roland could make her happy, he was welcome to try. The night carried on, the ballroom alive with music from a talented quintet. Anthony danced with his nieces, sisters, and even his mother, though Gracie seemed happiest swaying on the dance floor with Nancy. Watching them, Anthony silently thanked whoever had brought Nancy into Gracie's life. The evening took a turn when Jimmy Whitehead, their younger brother, approached Lisa, demanding a conversation with Gracie to make amends. His insistence led to an argument, escalating until Lisa struck him, sending him to the floor. Before Anthony could intervene, their mother firmly ordered Jimmy to leave. Shaking his head, Anthony sat back at his table. Gracie, clearly upset, was gently led away by Nancy, who comforted her with quiet reassurances. It was a scene that nearly broke Anthony's heart, but once again, Nancy proved she was exactly what Gracie needed. After 2 glasses of water, Nancy managed to coax Gracie back onto the dance floor, and Anthony shared a small smile with Lisa as they watched. Before the night ended, Anthony took his mother's hand and led her to the dance floor for one last waltz. He hadn't planned to stay so late, but as the ballroom emptied, he realized he hadn't seen Roland or Cheyenne again. He assumed they had either passed out somewhere or been discreetly asked to leave. What puzzled him most was why Cheyenne still held a membership at the club. She had loathed it when they were married. More importantly, how was she affording it? At the coat check, the young woman's earlier bright smile had dimmed. When Anthony asked what was wrong, the story spilled out. Her boyfriend had taken her car while she was at work and wasn't responding to her calls. She was due to finish her shift soon, but she had no way home. Anthony handed her his phone, suspecting the boyfriend was ignoring her calls but might answer an unknown number. He was right. On the third ring, Trey Edmonton picked up. In his best authoritative voice, Anthony informed him that his team would ensure she got home safely. The young woman, Vanessa, or Nessie, as she introduced herself, looked at Anthony in shock when he ended the call. Moments later, Trey was frantically trying to call back. Anthony ignored it, letting Vanessa know her boyfriend was likely drunk and not worth waiting for. Since her own phone started ringing next, she had no choice but to accept reality. When Anthony offered her a ride home, she hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. The drive took 24 minutes. Along the way, he learned that Vanessa lived with her mother, stepfather, and 2 stepsisters in a cramped 2-room apartment. In her cheap jacket and club-issued uniform, Anthony decided that Nessie didn't suit her. She was Vanessa. Before she got out of the car, she insisted on exchanging numbers. To Anthony's amusement, she took his phone, entered her contact information, and called herself to ensure she had his. When she leaned in to kiss him goodbye, she gently nipped his bottom lip before pulling away. On his way home, Anthony passed a police cruiser with a detained young man sitting in the back seat. He had no doubt it was Vanessa's now ex-boyfriend. Only after parking in his garage did Anthony finally exhale. His adrenaline was still high as he brushed his teeth, playing over the night's events in his head. Just after midnight, his phone rang. Seeing Vanessa's name on the screen, he briefly considered setting her ringtone to Brown-Eyed Girl by Van Morrison. She greeted him cheerfully, then wasted no time inviting him to dinner with her family. It would be a traditional New Year's meal: ham, black-eyed peas, and cabbage cooked with a pound of bacon. Anthony hesitated, pointing out their age difference. He was turning 42 in February. Vanessa dismissed the concern without hesitation. "So what? 42-year-olds don't eat?" Anthony laughed, realizing he had no argument. Lunch was at 1. Anthony had no plans for lunch, but cabbage cooked with a pound of bacon sounded tempting. He figured he'd stop by, enjoy the meal, thank Vanessa and her mother for their hospitality, and be on his way. Burns & Burns grocery store was still open, so he picked up a bottle of wine that paired well with ham. While browsing, he spotted a 6-pack of St. Elizabeth Lager and grabbed it too. Heading in the wrong direction, he nearly ran into the bakery counter just as fresh loaves of French bread were being placed on display. The timing was perfect. As he walked past the floral section, he paused. Grocery stores sold flowers? A young employee assured him it was the best deal around, far cheaper than any florist. Without much thought, Anthony picked up 2 vases of fresh flowers, one a colorful mix, the other white roses. At the checkout, the tired cashier smiled, scanning the vases carefully. She jokingly asked if he was trying to make someone jealous. Anthony played along, suggesting it might even lead to a shootout. She laughed, and as he left, he muttered that he wished she'd been around when he was getting divorced. Back in his car, he removed the price tags and carefully placed the vases on the floor of the passenger seat before driving to Vanessa's apartment complex. Vanessa greeted him at the door with her usual enthusiasm, her eyes lighting up when he handed her the white roses. Her mother, Natalie, was strikingly similar to her daughter. Same blonde hair, same warm brown eyes. She welcomed him with a firm handshake before playfully scolding him for bringing wine, beer, and bread. Vanessa proudly showed off the roses, and Natalie, despite her initial protest, admired them, gently running her fingers over the soft petals. Anthony had one more surprise. He returned to his car and brought in the second bouquet. Natalie protested again, but Anthony simply pointed out that if they were feeding him, it was the least he could do. Introductions followed. Vanessa's younger sisters, Clarissa and Bunny, were lively and full of energy. At Natalie's request, Bunny ran down the hall to call their father to dinner. The noise was loud enough that Anthony was sure the downstairs neighbors weren't thrilled. Frank, their father, entered moments later, scooping Bunny up and playfully swatting her before greeting Anthony with a firm handshake. The man was large, exuding the kind of strength that came from years of physical labor. Lunch was loud, full of laughter and energy. The wine was passed around, even to the younger girls who took one sip before grimacing and rinsing their mouths with sweet tea. When Natalie noticed the lager Anthony had brought, she insisted they all have a beer as well. Frank, clearly pleased, declared that Vanessa should bring Anthony around more often. Dessert was banana pudding, and Anthony didn't even have to be asked if he liked it. Who didn't? Over coffee, conversation drifted to Vanessa's childhood. They shared stories, showed him baby pictures, and even discussed Frank's ex-wife, who had abandoned the family years ago. As the afternoon went on, Frank mentioned his job as a mailman, and Bunny proudly repeated it, adding a Mr. Tony before his name. Natalie caught the nickname and questioned it. Apparently, Vanessa had decided he was now Tony. Anthony didn't mind, especially when Vanessa squeezed his hand and rested her head on his shoulder. The conversation shifted again, and Frank casually announced that their family was about to grow. Natalie was expecting. Vanessa's shocked reaction made it clear this was news to her. At some point, the gathering moved from the dining table to the small living room, where Anthony found himself wedged into the couch with Vanessa tucked beside him. When he admitted he was the COO of Whitehead Generators, Frank only nodded, recognizing the name but mentioning that it wasn't on his mail route. For reasons he couldn't explain, Anthony felt the need to downplay his position. He shared how, before his father's death, he had worked in civil engineering for St. Anne Parish. Frank seemed to recognize him from those days, but his main observation was that Anthony had lost a significant amount of weight. When it was finally time to leave, Vanessa clung to him. As he grabbed his coat, she put hers on as well. Curious, Anthony asked where they were going. She simply smiled and grabbed his hand. He hadn't been to the movies in ages, so they decided on that. Standing outside the Joy 4 Theater in LG, Louisiana, they huddled together against the sharp wind rolling off the Atchafalaya River. The line was long, nearly 40 people ahead of them. As Anthony scanned the crowd, his gaze landed on a familiar blonde just a few people ahead. Dark roots peeked through, but it was unmistakably Cheyenne. She wasn't with Roland, though. The young man clinging to her was someone new. Oblivious to the people around them, they were fully engrossed in each other, kissing and shamelessly groping. Anthony had never given much thought to Cheyenne's behavior during their marriage, until now. Watching her shamelessly grope a new lover in public, he realized how often she had been unaccounted for over the years. The unexplained absences, the defensive responses, the constant, "you don't own me" retorts whenever he questioned her whereabouts. It all seemed glaringly obvious in hindsight. A sharp gust of wind cut through the parking lot, making Vanessa shiver. Anthony pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her nose. His attention was drawn back to Cheyenne when someone in line made a remark, prompting her to turn. When she spotted him, her arrogant expression faltered, momentarily replaced by fear. Anthony simply smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Almost instantly, Cheyenne's face twisted into a sneer. Her eyes flicked to Vanessa. "One of Gracie's little friends?" she taunted. Anthony remained unfazed. Introducing Vanessa as his girlfriend, he politely acknowledged Cheyenne's companion, Tim, before casually inquiring about Roland. "Too drunk," Cheyenne muttered, turning away. Inside the theater, Anthony let Vanessa pick the movie, much to her surprise. As they stood behind Cheyenne and Tim in the snack line, she hesitated before ordering. Anthony reassured her she could get whatever she wanted. Cheyenne, overhearing the exchange, snapped her head around. Her shock was evident as she processed Vanessa calling him Tony. The line inched forward. Cheyenne, still reeling, recalled how Anthony had once nearly snapped when she called him by that name. He shrugged, telling her he simply didn't care about her the way he cared about Vanessa. Cheyenne fired back, predicting Vanessa would eventually be discarded like everyone else. Anthony, unbothered, countered that only those who acted like trash got thrown away. "Why don't you go to hell?" Cheyenne spat. Anthony merely smiled. The line's moving. After the movie, he reluctantly parted ways with Vanessa, reminding her that work called in the morning. Her kisses at the door were soft and lingering, filled with unspoken promises. Instead of heading straight home, Anthony stopped by his mother's. Susan had coffee waiting, and he joined her at the kitchen counter, recounting his run-in with Cheyenne at the theater. Susan listened silently, then calmly revealed a truth Anthony hadn't expected. Cheyenne hadn't cheated, at least not during the first 2 years of their marriage. Anthony was stunned. When he pressed for details, Susan handed him a plastic folder. It was from a private investigator his father had hired, chronicling 27 months of surveillance. Cheyenne had been reckless with money, a heavy drinker, and generally irresponsible. But she hadn't been unfaithful. If she had, "We would have told you," Susan assured him. Anthony flipped through the report, digesting the reality of a marriage that had been doomed from the start. His father, despite their strained relationship, had tried to protect him. By morning, Anthony was back in his routine. A grueling workout at Arthur Porter's gym was followed by a quick massage and shower before heading to Whitehead Generators. Seeing the nearly full parking lot, he nodded in satisfaction. Most employees had shown up on the first workday of the year. He walked through the workshop, bracing against the cold, and climbed the metal steps to his office. Without hesitation, he summoned Brent Collier. Brent sauntered in, grinning, but his smirk faded when Anthony cut him off before he could sit down. The first major change of the year was his dismissal. Shocked, Brent sputtered in protest, claiming Anthony's father had promised him job security. Anthony calmly asked for written proof. Brent had none. As security escorted Brent out, he made one last attempt to rattle Anthony, boasting that the workers were loyal to him, not Whitehead Generators. Anthony didn't even flinch. "They're loyal to their paychecks and their families," he said. "Now, leave my office." Later that morning, his phone buzzed. Seeing Tony on the screen, he smiled. Vanessa's voice was playful. "Are you bored?" He thought about her question, his mind drifting back to the way she had teased him at the theater. Her kisses had tasted like buttered popcorn and chocolate. Her fingers had traced dangerously close to his belt, and her warm breath against his neck had left him trembling. His grin widened. "I miss you." Still holding his phone, he turned to his assistant, Courtney. When she asked how his new year had been, he gave an unusually enthusiastic response. "Incredible. Just incredible." Courtney was caught off guard by his uncharacteristic mood. Anthony barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, specifically on Vanessa. His eyes flicked toward her name on his phone screen as an idea took shape. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and headed out. He had something to do. Anthony learned Vanessa was working that afternoon and struggling to arrange a ride since her car had been impounded after her ex-boyfriend's DUI arrest. Without hesitation, he offered to drive her. Her enthusiastic response came in the form of a string of kiss emojis. Arriving at her apartment, he was immediately pulled into a series of warm embraces. Bunny, Clarissa, Natalie, and finally Vanessa each greeted him with a hug before he could even step inside. By the time they left, he had to go through the same round of farewells. They stopped at Dusty's Country Kitchen for lunch before heading to Hardington Acres Country Club. As they sat together, Vanessa leaned in to kiss him, and Anthony nervously reached into his coat pocket. He had seen a photo she sent earlier, a simple snapshot, but his attention had been drawn to her bare neck. With a bit of hesitation, he presented her with a thin box. Inside was a gold necklace with 3 diamonds in the center. Vanessa's eyes widened in disbelief as she asked if it was real. Amused, Anthony reassured her. He wouldn't risk turning her neck green. She studied him carefully before asking what it meant. Stumbling over his words, Anthony admitted that it meant he liked her, was glad they had met, and that maybe he was her boyfriend. Vanessa smiled, already certain of the answer. Lowering her voice, she added that she didn't share the kind of moments they had in the movie theater with just anyone. Their time together was cut short as she rushed to start her shift, nearly struggling with the door in her hurry. Anthony called after her, asking what time she would be done. She promised to text him. Returning to work, Anthony went through the motions, but his mind remained elsewhere, replaying the feel of Vanessa's kisses, the taste of popcorn and chocolate mixed with butter and salt, the warmth of her touch in the darkened theater. Courtney's voice pulled him back, notifying him that the Department of Labor was on line 3. He handled the call, only to find another blinking light. Cheyenne. Cheyenne wasted no time, immediately issuing a threat. If Anthony so much as mentioned her involvement with Tim DeRowland, there would be consequences. Anthony, unimpressed, had no intention of meddling in her latest drama. Amused, he quipped that Rowland had already been unfortunate enough to end up with a lying, cheating mess. Why would he ruin that? Before she could respond, he ended the call. Later that evening, the factory was quiet as Anthony walked through the empty space, considering a second shift. The costs were minimal compared to the potential gains. Increased production would justify the additional labor, and overhead expenses remained the same, regardless of whether the plant was operational. At 9:50, his phone vibrated. Vanessa was finishing work in 10 minutes. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. When she slid into the passenger seat, Anthony immediately mentioned she needed Saturday off. She confirmed her schedule, though there was a hint of sadness as she admitted her job was ending on Friday. At Gracie's birthday party that weekend, Vanessa called him Tony in front of his entire family. The reaction was instant. 7 of the 8 women at the gathering gasped in unison. Amused, Anthony pointed out that no one called him that. Vanessa, unfazed, declared that she did. Then she caught him off guard by licking the tip of his nose, making him recoil in surprise. Later, as they sat in his Bentley, her preferred choice over his other car, Vanessa idly played with the necklace around her neck before quietly asking him to take her home. Not her apartment, his home. There was hesitation in her voice, uncertainty in her eyes. As she instinctively crossed her arms over her stomach, Anthony realized she was self-conscious. She was afraid of judgment, convinced she wasn't perfect. He whispered the truth against her skin. She was beautiful. As she lay beside him, the only thing she wore was the gold necklace. Even in the dim light from the bay window, her worry lingered. Anthony kissed her softly, repeating the words until she finally believed them. And when she whispered, "I love you," he knew she meant it. By the end of the month, the first board meeting of the year was held. Susan, as acting CEO, and Lisa, the CFO, proposed a feasibility study for adding a second shift. Anthony, already certain of the benefits, was frustrated by the delay. Despite holding proxy votes from Cindy and Barbara, he was outnumbered. Susan, Lisa, Jimmy, and Gracie's proxy vote pushed for caution. After the meeting, only Susan and Anthony remained in the boardroom. Without a word, she slid a file toward him. It was a report on Vanessa. His frustration flared instantly. Susan defended her actions, stating that given his track record with women, she had every reason to look into his new relationship. She had even investigated Nancy, Gracie's partner, and found nothing concerning. Still irritated, Anthony sarcastically asked if Vanessa's high school diploma was enough for him to continue dating her. Susan simply smiled. "Please do, Tony." Before he left, she added that if there was ever another woman after Vanessa, she'd investigate her too, just as she would for anyone Jimmy dated. Anthony shook his head and walked out, muttering a "good night, Mom." Spring arrived, melting away the last traces of winter. In April, at Gracie's wedding, Anthony had the honor of walking Nancy down the aisle. As they moved past the rows of smiling guests, he felt something rare, pure, unfiltered happiness. After the ceremony, Jimmy approached the newlyweds, offering sincere congratulations. As he turned to leave, Anthony saw the pain in his younger brother's eyes. The weight of past mistakes lingered, but for once, Jimmy tried to make things right. Vanessa, standing beside Anthony, gently squeezed his hand. Without hesitation, Anthony stepped forward, pulling Jimmy into a firm embrace. "I love you," Anthony said. Jimmy tried to respond, but was too choked with emotion. As he hurried away, the waiter muttered for someone to call his mentor. On May 27th, Natalie Arnaud gave birth to Claire Marie Arnaud, adding another member to Vanessa's ever-growing family. And Anthony, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel like an outsider looking in. On June 1st, Anthony handed Jimmy his final instructions, called him a fool, and walked out of Whitehead Generators. He climbed into the rented motorhome and headed straight for the Spanish Armada apartments. Before he could even park, Vanessa was already running down the stairs, suitcase in hand. He laughed, knowing there was no way that tiny bag held all of her things, let alone Bunny and Clarissa's. Upstairs, Natalie proudly showed off baby Claire before they gathered the girls for a surprise. Bunny and Clarissa raced toward them after school, squealing with excitement when they learned they were going to Disneyland. A week later, sunburned but happy, they were on the road home. As Bunny leaned against Anthony, she looked up and declared, "You need to marry Nessie." Anthony played along, asking why. "Because she loves you," Bunny said simply. "That's a pretty good reason," he admitted. Back at the apartment, Anthony received sleepy hugs before saying goodbye. The drive to return the rental was exhausting, and stepping into his own house that night, he realized how empty it felt. Calling his mother, he announced he was home. Susan, ever sarcastic, pretended she hadn't noticed he was gone. Their usual banter followed, but Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. That night, he stretched out in his own bed, missing Vanessa's scent, the warmth of her skin, and the simple comfort of having her beside him. The next morning, Bunny opened the apartment door, greeting him with her usual hug. When Vanessa appeared, still half asleep, sunburned and beautiful, Anthony didn't wait. Dropping to one knee in the narrow hallway, he blurted out, "Vanessa, will you marry me?" As music filled the air, Anthony watched Vanessa and Frank walk down the white silk aisle. His breath caught when he saw her in the wedding dress, his mother's gown from nearly 50 years ago. When Susan had suggested it, Anthony had asked if that meant she finally approved. "Of course," she had said. "And you?" she asked in return. He had smirked. "Not so sure. Remember, Mom, in a few years you'll be old and I'll be your guardian." Susan had gasped, then muttered something about karma and future children. Now, standing at the altar, Anthony took Vanessa's hands. As she smiled up at him, he knew this was exactly where he was meant to be.